Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today. We are excited to have you here for our first session this morning of the Pathlock Innovation Series for the PeopleSoft Innovation Day. Our session today is titled Streamline PeopleSoft Identity and Access Governance Processes with Zero Trust. Our presenter today is Greg Wendt, who will introduce himself in just a moment. My name is Stephanie Anderson. I'm the Global Webinar Manager here at Pathlock. Before we go any further though, we have a few housekeeping items to go over. If you have any issues with your audio during this webinar, just click on Preferences and then Audio. From there, you can check to see if you're using the appropriate audio device. You can also click on the play sound to check if you can hear the sound coming through your speakers. This presentation will take approximately 40 minutes. There will be a Q&A session following the presentation, so please type any questions into the questions box that you'll see on your control panel for our speaker to answer at the end of the event. To prevent background noise, everyone is on mute. And I'm going to put a link in the chat right now that you'll see that has the link to all of the sessions coming out for the rest of the day. So if you would like to click on that link, you can look at the schedule, and if there's any other sessions you haven't registered for, we encourage you to do so. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Greg.
Thanks, Stephanie. So yes, as you said, my name is Greg Wendt. I'm an Executive Director for the Security Solutions here at Pathlock. So just a little bit about me for those of you who might not know me. I started with PeopleSoft really back in the late 90s, working on a inventory module for an oil and gas company. After that, I went in and worked for a retail company and did HCM and financials. Actually did self-service rollout on the version 7 applets back in the day with about 45,000 employees. So, and then enterprise architect through a lot of those times as well, and then worked higher ed for 11 years and managed campus solutions, HCM financials, and the portal system. So I've been in and around PeopleSoft since version 5 all the way to the 9.2 platforms. And one of the things that I've really had to do through my career is I've been dotted line to the CISOs, incident response, implementing massive single sign-on projects, massive self-service projects to where doing multi-factor authentication, implementing single sign-on, rolling out functionality to tens of thousands of users at one time, and trying to do that in a secure manner. So a lot of that, I'll bring to bear today on the session. So as Stephanie said, this is really streamlining PeopleSoft identity access governance process with zero trust. So a little bit about who we are as well. So who is Pathlock and what do we do? So what we do is leverage integrations to provide a 360-degree view of risk across your application set. That means an awful lot, and it says an awful lot of things. So one of the things that we really focus on is being able to provide compliant provisioning. And that's really important, especially when we're talking about the aspect of zero trust and identity and access governance, because it's all going to tie together. So you're really going to see how we can close that loop today to help ensure that all of your employees are going through the exact same processes, have the exact same type of security, provision securely, and all of those types of things as well. So a little bit more about us. We are the market leading application security and controls automation platform, and that's one of the things that you're going to see today. Some of our customers, I'm not really going to dig into those, and our partners as well. So let's go ahead and jump into the content. And as Stephanie said, if you have any questions, just use the questions dialog on the GoToWebinar control panel there. So when we think about some of the previous ways that we have, had to manage access, because that's one of the challenges when you're talking about how do we do zero trust and implement it in a secure manner. Previously, it's very manual. It's something that you're going to be shooting emails back and forth. Think about the onboarding process. We're going to hire this person. We've decided to hire them. What is their job going to be? Now we've got to get them. We've got to get a computer. We've got to get them a desk. We've got to set all this stuff up. So there's multitude of stakeholders that are involved in this entire process. And there's typically tedious reviews. What type of computer are they going to get? What type of access are they going to get? Are they going to be, modeled after Greg as an enterprise architect? Are they going to be an AP clerk or an HR clerk? What are they going to do? And all of that access has to be set up and controlled. So typically there's a very slow onboarding process. We've talked to organizations that really take, 30 to 45 days before somebody is actually really in the organization and has all of the access that they need to be able to do the functionality that they have to, that they were hired to do. So you really end up with a lot of unproductive users and lost time. So that costs the organization. You don't really have as many employees as you probably need for the amount of work that's out there. So when you have unproductive people, it makes everybody work a little bit faster and harder. So you end up with a lot of human error, and it really comes down to misaligned resources. So you have a problem, getting everybody focused on the exact process of what needs to take place. A lot of times, and you'll see this later, it's just like, hey, copy this security and give it to somebody else. That's how a lot of this is done in the ERP space, because it's difficult to really drill in and understand what the problem is. And that really can start the whole process flow of what becomes an issue. So Pathlock has a very unique governance approach, and it focuses on data security. It's really different than a lot of our competitors. And one of the ways that we're able to do that is because we have fine-grained access and analysis provisioning. And we can do that into a lot of different business applications. We've got those touch points through those integrations. And what we're also looking at is really the difference between can do and did do. And I'm going to go into this a little bit more later, so I'm just going to touch on it real briefly here. But can do is, what can I currently see? What are my authorizations within my applications? So let's say I'm saying applications for a reason, because maybe it is HCM, financials, Salesforce, Active Directory. It's across the board. So what can I do in all of those? And then you have to pair that with what did I do? That's the difference between just being able to see, okay, here's the permission list, the roles that somebody has access to, versus here's the actual transactions that they looked at. And then it's got to integrate directly into the system to provide dynamic access. We do have a centralized policy management, so that makes it much easier as well. But the main focus of this is our approach focuses on the data security level, not just the process controls. So when we talk about the disconnected processes and the systems that are critical for improving controls and compliance, what are all of those systems? Obviously, it has to be cross-application. Why? Because you've got to understand what this user has access to across your entire environment. If not, how are you supposed to assess their risk? Typically, a lot of ERPs are managed as silos. Even HCM and finance, for example, you're going to have different business owners, different data owners, different people making decision as to who has what access. Do they talk to the other groups? Is there commonality between that? So what happens if somebody has access inside of HCM and financials, and that causes increased risk because of what they have in the two different systems? Can you see that risk? Do you have access to it? Are you able to tell what the variances are between those two different systems? And then transaction controls. You've got to be able to decide, based upon risk, what the user is doing. Should they be able to access this? Should they be able to access the data? Should data masking be there? Those types of things. And then the user access reviews, the access design and certification. User access reviews are something that is a challenge for many organizations, and they really don't like doing it. I've never been with an organization that really thought that was a fun process. Just think about how often you went through and maybe redesigned your roles. That was something that you'd look at every 3 to 5 years, maybe. How often would you actually look at each and every one of your users to see what their roles and processes were? Did they have the right security inside of the system? And that's where you end up with that over privileging of users, because they end up with role creep. And what happens when you have a mover, for example? They were doing, let's say, an AP clerk, and then all of a sudden they switch to another job, so they're a manager, or they do something else, and now all of a sudden they gain additional access because of that new job, and the old access was never taken away. It was supposed to be, but they needed it for 2 to 3 weeks or a month or 6 weeks, and now we basically forgot. Now it's just standard, and this user's just going to keep that even though they don't actually use that particular access, or they shouldn't have it from a risk perspective. So that really makes a challenge inside of the organization. And a lot of that is because of the cost of the manual effort, because much of this is done in spreadsheets. There's not an automated form to do this. Even when you're talking about the access requests that are coming in, or the correct approvals, the workflows that are happening, so it becomes very disconnected with the audit processes as well. So, that's one of the reasons why you see so much insider theft. That's why those challenges exist, because the fraud is there. People know what's going on, and they know that the department or the security or the logging or the, all of those transactions aren't going to be caught. So it becomes very easy for them to, let's say, abuse the system, whether that's on data or whether that's on theft. Hopefully it's not happening, but I've seen it across the board in many different organizations. So let's talk a little bit about zero trust. And then we're going to bring these two really together to understand why it's very important to complete this circle, especially inside of your ERP system. So zero trust is really no access is trusted by default. You're either inside or outside the network. You basically have to prove who you are. You've got to go through those checks and balances, and that's implemented using contextual attributes to determine that risk is really what it is. And it could be a multitude of things, whether it's where their user's coming from, the time of day, the device, what type of transaction they're working with. It could just be the fact that, from a security perspective or cyber insurance risk, that you have to implement single sign-on or multi-factor, for example. And, all of those steps have to take place before you're going to be able to get your cyber insurance. So, zero trust is really about everybody having to prove who they are. And it's about least privileged access. So don't allow them to do anything or see anything that they don't need access to. That's what zero trust is to me. And we think about one of the things that really goes with it a lot is multi-factor authentication. What is multi-factor authentication and how do you do it? How do you do it? A lot of times it's at login. Many organizations do it with single sign-on. Maybe sometimes you trust the browser, you trust the location. That comes down to, if I'm in the office and I'm on my delivered, company work PC or Mac, should I have to go through MFA? Maybe I do, maybe I don't. Kind of depends upon what your security policies are. I'm not a big fan of that whole, I can trust this for 30 days, because I don't really think that really adds a lot of value to it. So I'm more about dynamic MFA and when and where to implement it based upon that dynamic risk profile. Especially nowadays with sensitive data. It's sensitive data is one of those Pandora boxes, because you start to open it up and who's got access to what and who can see what anywhere inside of the system. And if we want to flip the thought process a little bit, it comes down to the fact of who really needs to be able to see that. Me as an employee, and then me as an architect, or let's say a payroll administrator, if I want to look at it that way. Those are two very different jobs and two very different roles of what I want to see inside of the system. For example, from a sensitive data perspective, me as an employee, I want to know that my data is protected. So when I go to HCM or whatever application I happen to be working with, I don't want to see my sensitive data. I know what my social security number is. I know my ID, my address, all of those types of things. So I want that data to be protected, especially when I'm accessing any of my data outside of the network. If I'm sitting at my desk, maybe it's okay, but for the most part, I don't want that data to be exposed. How often do I really change my bank account? And that's one of the highest areas of theft inside of ERP systems is bank account information and stealing payroll checks. Medical disability, all of those things that, why do I need to see these? I know the values of those things. I've got my social security number at home. I don't need to have to go to HR to see it, for example. So that's where sensitive data and being able to view that, especially in the idea of zero trust, really circles around as to why do I need access to this information. When I'm a high privileged user though, I need to be able to see this to either validate it, enter users, things like that. But I can have access to the entire organizational data at that particular point. And that's where, when somebody has that high level access, that's typically where we're going to see that implementation of multi-factor authentication. So, if I can run a report, if I can see everybody in the entire organization, you're talking about possibly tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of users. That's where your huge data thefts come in. So especially when you're accessing a system or accessing transactions remotely or within a higher risk profile, you definitely want to implement that multi-factor at that target point. So that way, if a hacker does get a hold of their credentials, it becomes much more difficult for them to access that information because they don't have that MFA. So when we think about what MFA is, just to kind of level set a little bit, it's something So that's your username, password. Obviously, those aren't as secure as they used to be, depending upon if you're implementing with single sign-on or if you're just using PeopleSoft authentication. PeopleSoft authentication isn't quite as robust as, say, integrating with SSO because they don't quite have all of the different rules and regulations that can be built inside of it for password expiry and strong passwords and all those other type of things. So there are advantages to SSO over that. But it's also then something you have, whether that's your phone, SMS, email, mobile app, a physical token. Used to be real popular years ago, and you have your little key fob that you would carry around and it was a rolling 6-digit number. Now everything's kind of gone to that soft token or pushing to the phone. And if we look at what, somebody hasn't implemented multi-factor yet, and you're looking at starting a project, it's definitely something that looking at CERT and the government and what they would recommend that you do, it's definitely the mobile applications. That's where they want to push you, because the SMS networks have all been hacked. So they're easy to spoof. You probably see those with the amount of, spam texts that you get these days. And then also email is not really a valid delivery model either, because, I've seen so many different attacks that were successful of just resetting somebody's password because they had access to their corporate email or personal email. And then, okay, well, I reset my password, I had access to the email, boom, boom, boom. Now I'm in the system. I'm a power user. I run a report, steal data, and I'm out. That's not a very difficult attack for a lot of for a lot of hackers that are out there. You just have to get somebody to fall for a phishing attack. So that's one of the reasons why you don't deliver the token via email. Makes sense? Yes. A lot of places still do. So that's one of the reasons why, CERT really pushes the mobile apps, because one, they're more secure than those other methods are at this particular point in time. And then it could be something you are as well with the biometrics, and that's evolving. Everybody, if you've got an iPhone or a Droid, there's different biometrics that are involved with that. Face ID and things like that. So, that's where things are headed. But, that's ultimately what multi-factor is about. It's extending and making it more than just your user ID and password, because that's not secure enough anymore. And when you access a PeopleSoft system, for example, once you put in that user ID and password, you are that user. So you're going to get all the roles permissions that system has for that user, regardless of where you're accessing the system from, unless you've gone through additional steps. So, multi-factor is very important. So let's kind of switch over to talking about some of the provisioning and how we do this and why it's important in a zero trust environment, and how it enables zero trust. When we think about a lot of the challenges from provisioning, it's really a lot of manual processes that have been the constraint. How much effort does it require to provision and deprovision a user? I was talking to some customers, or maybe not customers actually, the other day, about different processes and flows and challenges. So since it's Christmas time of year, let's kind of go through. And I worked retail in the past, so it was something that is very easy for me to deal with because I've got a lot of history with it. We would hire 10,000, 5,000, 10,000, depending upon the season, employees during the holiday crush. So how are we going to provision all of those users? How are we going to make sure they have a consistent security model, just like everybody else within the organization? Because they're still employees. So they still need to do things like multi-factor or single sign-on. They still need to be able to get to their W-2s from a tax perspective. They still have to update all of their information within the system. All of that needs to be done because they're an employee. So how are you going to manage that? I've talked to organizations in the past, oh, well, we do single sign-on for corporate users or high privileged users, but all the self-service users are, just two-tier user ID and password type of ID, and it's like, well, why is the difference? Why? Because we can't provision them. It's too much work, and if you think about that process flow, for example, if your security team is provisioning 10,000 users, what are they actually able to do to help the most, the other 20% that have your biggest, highest privilege and biggest access risks inside of the system? So it's kind of mistargeting the resources on top of it. And then how much time is actually needed to execute user access reviews? How frequently are you doing? Is it a challenge for you? Most organizations it is, because it's still spreadsheet oriented. It's still very manual process. It's not something that's automated. And every time you do it, it's basically like starting fresh. There needs to be some automation. There needs to be some systems around that can, one, keep the history. Two, when the auditors come in, it's easy for them to see the checks and balances of what's been done in the past. So it allows them to pull it up, and that alleviates and really frees up your time to make you more effective. And then are you even looking at or enforcing SOD, and how are you doing that? So all of these things really come down to people, processes, and technology, and all of them have to work together to enable each one. You've got to have, it's almost like an orchestration of what's going on between all of these different pieces to make sure that they're done both effectively and efficiently inside of your systems. So when we talk about how Pathlock improves IAM with automation, for example, automation really enables you to do more with less. That's going to allow your employees to work more effectively. One of the things that's important to understand there is, though, let's start with like provisioning. Just starting at the provisioning level without making sure that it's a compliant provisioning model, does that really help you? That's the real challenge. You've got to have all of these things working in concert together. Otherwise, you're kind of missing the boat, because it's about streamlining those GRC strategies, and that's going to take analytics. It's going to take algorithms. It's going to take a little bit of work to do that. But once you get those in place, that's where you become super effective and super consistent inside of your applications and your process flows. So when we start with automated provisioning, I talk to groups that have done this, and some of them are like, oh, we've got that solved. I don't have to worry about that particular problem. But what are you provisioning? Is it compliant? Is it going through any SOD analysis, any checks, any risk? What is it actually going through a user access review? All of those things have to come in together when you're talking about provisioning, because SOD is a huge part about it. Because if I'm actually, provisioning, but then giving out roles and authorizations that cause an SOD risk, well, that's not very good. I can't do that. That doesn't make sense. So that's why we go back to all of these processes have to enable each other. Then when you're talking about adding in privileged access management, break glass, firefighter, whatever you want to call that particular process, and then those user access reviews, going through and being able to build out these processes and have that consistency and do it on a quarterly basis. I talked to an organization the other day. They're actually doing high privileged, and this is kind of forced by auditors, external auditors. They're moving high privileged user access reviews to monthly, every 30 days. Who's ready for that as an organization? Not many. That's a big jump for a lot of people. When we're talking about, self-service, those types of users, maybe they're every 6 months, once a year, because they don't have access to a lot of information. But, those high privileged users do. So it becomes a challenge. And really part of the challenge is the user lifecycle that has to happen on all of these accounts. When you see that life cycle, and this really is a life cycle, because it's it lives and breathes and is really important to how your organization structures as a whole. But it's also extremely important for understanding what your organizational risks are as a whole. When we start with role design, one of the things, because we have both internal to applications, like PeopleSoft with our application security platform, and then we also have our Pathlock system that sits outside. And one of the advantages of that, the Pathlock system sitting outside, is when you talk about role design, it allows you to look at that differently. So, and what I want to do is step back for just a second and kind of think about that and explain it in a different way. So let's say we have a financials, clerk or a payroll administrator. Pick and choose whatever job role you want that person to do. Well, they've got applications throughout your organization, right? So it could be anything from Salesforce, because you're doing CRM. It could be Active Directory. They've got to have access to email and SharePoint, and all those other types of things. Office, maybe they have VPN access, maybe they don't have VPN. They're going to need HCM, they're going to need financials. So they've got a plethora of applications that exist inside of all of their different access points, right? So they have authorizations all over the place. So what it allows you to do from a role perspective is think about it like that. Okay, this payroll administrator needs access to CRM. They need access to HCM. They need access to financials. They need, Salesforce. They need Active Directory. They need VPN to be able to do these types of things. Well, you could group that access together, because you're talking about cross-application provisioning and deprovisioning. So it allows you to holistically look at that and say, all right, this is what the authorizations need to be for this user to access all of these different systems. You can also have very tactical if you want role design. So it's, one-to-one type of thing if you want it at that particular level. But it does allow you the ability to change the thought process on your roles. The advantages to changing the thought process on the roles is it really removes the silos, is the ultimate goal there. Because if you're going to look at the risk and understand the risk profile of a specific user, you have to look at them holistically across your applications. You got to be able to understand, oh, that's what they have in HCM, and this is what they're doing in financials, and that causes a problem. Those aren't good. We can't have the two of those together. Whereas before, typically you would look at that as a strict vertical, and you would not compare the access between those two systems. So that's why the role design is important, and just kind of thinking about it differently, of grouping it into, here are my business roles. This is what this user needs to really do that function inside of my organization. And then that jumps into the provisioning and deprovisioning. And really that's about deploying role-based access control. So what we're going to do with that particular user is we're going to create them, we're going to update roles, we're going to update what they have access to, all of those types of things, onboarding, offboarding, the mover process, those are all of the things that you're going to need to be able to do. Then we get into, how are you going to manage the access requests? How do you typically do those now? Typically, it's either a request from the super user or from the data owner, who's going to say, I need to set up Jimmy and he needs to be modeled like Greg. Okay, so then the security administrator goes and does that. Who approves it? Often not, sometimes the same person that requested it. Not a good security model, not a good request model. It's all happening via emails, things like that. So when you're talking about being audited, it's a pain for everybody involved. So we need a process. We need to be able to manage those requests compliantly and implement those requests compliantly. So all of that needs to be blended into one. And then we've got the user access reviews. What are we going to do with those reviews? How often are they going to happen? Is it a manual process? Is it an automated process? What can we do to help there? Because that's really one of the processes that probably needs to be automated and improved for most organizations is the user access reviews. You can gain a ton of time, and it really will decrease your risks when you get that process flow in place. The last three I kind of like to talk about together with the SOD audit: sample testing and violation management, because it really boils down to how often are you really doing an SOD audit? What's your sample testing? dealing with the audits that I have in the past, it's typically they'll come in and they'll run some SQL, they look at some things from the third party. Okay, this is the sample group that I worked with. You may get hit, you may get not. All kind of depends upon which sample group they look at. They're not looking at it holistically. So those audits are only a small finding of what you may or may not have from a violation perspective inside of your system. So it becomes really difficult to quantify your entire risk profile because you're not really validating all of your risk. You're only looking at a small segment of that because of that sample testing. So that's an area that many organizations really need improvement on as well. So let's jump over and demo some of this. So I am going to change my system over here real quick, and what I want to do is I'm going to start with, let's think about zero trust and how we're going to do that and what that means to our systems from an authentication perspective, a multi-factor perspective. How are we going to integrate all of these different features into our PeopleSoft system holistically and streamlined to where the end users really don't have, additional work or time and effort to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to authenticate into my identity provider. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually putting in or authenticating to Microsoft. So I'm putting in my user ID and password to Microsoft. What I'm doing here is creating a session with my identity provider, because what we can do is either SP or IP initiated single sign-on, so we can tie into any SAML2 identity provider. Why is that important? Because if you look at SOX compliance, for example, single sign-on is one of the checkboxes. It shows the maturity of your organization. That's why it's important to be able to do these types of things. So I'm going to jump in and I can immediately access one of my PeopleSoft systems. So I'm going to go ahead. You can see the deep embedded link. What's going to happen is a new window is going to open, and it's going to communicate back to the identity provider and allow that user in. So now I've got access to the system, all based upon that trust of the identity provider. So I'm not having to use my PeopleSoft user IDs and passwords. Why is that important? Well, now let's think about provisioning. Close that loop altogether, and I'll come back to that. So hold that note for just a little bit. But the user comes in. Now I've got access to data masking. This is really the least privileged part. My social security number isn't exposed. It's conditional. Maybe if I'm on the network, I can view it. If I'm at home or outside of the network, then it's going to be masked, all those types of scenarios. So really allows me to protect and implement that least privileged model through the single sign-on solution. As I access, I'm going to go back home here real quick. One of the areas that we see many organizations have issues with is multi-factor authentication. I'm not a big proponent of multi-factor authentication at single sign-on. Why? Because it's too far away from the event that actually needs the authorization. I can do a lot of things inside of PeopleSoft. There's a lot of pages that I can access that really don't have a lot of sensitive information on them. So why do I need to pass MFA for that particular challenge? There's a lot of desensitization around multi-factor because you're just hammered with it over and over and over. So it really boils down to do that effectively. Do it at the point in time where it's needed. I'm looking at the direct deposit pages, for example. So how often, I go back to what I stated earlier, how often are you even changing this information? Not very frequently. Maybe you forgot how much is going into savings, checking, how much is going into the kids fund, for their little, bank card or whatever. You may go look at those particular values, but you don't need access to the account number. You don't need to change that because typically you're only going to do that once, twice a year, maybe, those types of things. So it's not something that you're going to, readily change, but it allows you, if you need to go through the process of implementing a multi-factor challenge at that point in time. So I can do that push notification. Let me approve that real quick on my phone. Yes, that's me. And then I have access to the data. That's point in time. That's real-time risk mitigation, implementing zero trust. So I didn't trust you. You had to prove who you were to be able to access that information right exactly at the point that you needed it. That's zero trust model. So we have the ability to implement all of those different factors inside of the PeopleSoft system, targeting exactly where you're at. Another area with zero trust is, how do I work with privileged access. One of the things about implementing single sign-on is you want to really remove anybody who's utilizing PeopleSoft authentication. You want everybody to go through single sign-on. So from that process flow, how do you act as, let's say, a PeopleSoft user, a batch user, a DBA user? That's typically a two-tier account that doesn't really change. We've got the ability to go in and do a switch identity, and you can then switch into a higher privileged account. The nice part about it is you pick a reason why. Let's say PeopleSoft administration. Let's say that I'm going to go into the PS account because it's the high privileged, all privileged account inside of PeopleSoft. Well, I can also have MFA tied to that. When somebody tries to access that account, yes, I'm going to approve that. And now I'm in as the system. So as in this privileged access, you'll see that I originally started as Vicky's in, and now I can, but I'm acting as PS. So we're going to create a log that understands everything that this user accesses during this session. So we're going to get menu component page, all that type of information, and it's going to be, this is Vicky's in acting as PS. So now you have the differentiating between my admins, my batch users. So setting up run controls. Sure, I can give that to everybody in financials. That's fine. Whoever updates it, I'll be able to track that back. I know who made that change, those types of things. But from an audit flow, I also understand who my high privilege users are. My PeopleSoft admins, I can say, oh, that was Jim or that was Sally. That's who did that access. It closes that loop. It goes back to zero trust. So those are some of the functionalities when you're talking about implementing multi-factor single sign-on to enable that full loop. Now let's I kind of had to come in as a high privileged user anyway here for just a minute because there's some functionality that I need to do. So let's look real quickly, and I want to talk about a user profile. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a mover process. So when we're talking about provisioning and deprovisioning, for example, so this particular user, I'm going to grab their employee ID here, PU020. 221, you're going to see that this user has specific roles already inside of the PeopleSoft system. So they've got this AG Composer user role. So that's the role that they currently have. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go out and I'm going to go to job data, which looks like has rolled off of there. So let's go down to workforce administration. We're going to go down to job information, and I'm not a fan of the alphabetized version of this. Just honestly, after 25 years, it takes a little while for me to remember where everything's at. So I'm going to go ahead and open up their record in job. So let's go through just the process flow to give them a new job. So I'm going to change their department because this is what I'm going to look at. So I'm going to backdate this to the 6th, tab out of there, and then let's come down here and we're going to change the department that they're a member of. So I'm going to change them from the office of the president to research. I'm going to go ahead and save this. This process right now is just a normal PeopleSoft user accessing the system and doing their day-to-day job, right? That's all that's occurring. I'm not having to do anything special. Now, really, this is where the magic is going to happen when you're talking about implementing compliant provisioning, deprovisioning, and how you complete this full circle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to run the process. So I moved over to our Pathlock cloud system at this point. What I'm doing, to give you a little bit of a back end, is we have a data store of a structure of what this employee or what the organization looks like. Some of the information that we have on there is what department they're a member of, for example. So what this process is doing is it is currently running to synchronize all of the information from that organizational store, which would be the PeopleSoft HCM, and we're synchronizing and looking to see if there's any changes. This can be scheduled to run. I'm just running it ad hocly because I just made the change. So it's comparing all of that data to find that change. So it's going to go out, see that. This is the advantage of it being outside of the PeopleSoft system, because you're going to see where it's able to kick off and provision in multiple different areas throughout the applications that this particular user may or may not have access to. So I'm going to switch over. I'm going to refresh this. It's probably been found. So sure, it's right down here. So what I've got here is a workflow. you're going to see that the comment that this is all happening because the department has changed for this particular employee ID or for this particular employer. I can update some files if I need to, employee information, what her name is, position title, employee department is research. So that's where she moved from office of the president, for example. But then we've also got the group mapping. What does this mean? These are the new authorizations that this particular user is going to have. So that's what's changing inside of Active Directory. That's what's changing inside of PeopleSoft. So all of that can be completely automated and done. All of this is done. If you have a question, you can submit that over to somebody, but this is all a workflow. This was all found by that department change coming from the PeopleSoft system. Has anybody done anything? No, this is all system generated. So we see that, we can flag that, and now we're going to create automation around this. This can be done with the mover process, with onboarding. So if you think about it from the onboarding, okay, we hired somebody. We're going to set up these roles, these permissions for them inside of Active Directory, inside of PeopleSoft. Now, all of a sudden, single sign-on works for them. It completes that loop, and you've basically done nothing because it can be completely automated. That's where the real magic comes in. So I'm going to go over here to either approve or decline, and I'm going to say approved GW, and I cannot spell this morning, but that's okay. I'm going to hit OK. So now what happens is the rest of the workflow is going to continue. So that workflow is going to go through the rest of the steps, which you'll see here in just a minute. It doesn't take but a couple of seconds to finish up the process. So that's already finished. I'm going to come back over and I'm going to refresh, and we're going to look at that particular process. So we can say that process is approved and it's also finished. So let's see what else was done for this process request. So once again, we know this was all based on the department change. The department is research. So some of the first actions that we took were to remove all the roles from the user in Active Directory and remove all the roles from the user in PeopleSoft. Why? Because they don't need those roles anymore, right? So we're cleaning all of that up, and we are compliantly provisioning them with just the access that they need for the new role that they have. So now we're going to go through and we're going to add Active Directory permissions. We're also going to add some PeopleSoft permissions. This is where we could also change, okay, this was done in HCM. We could also add financials. We could also add Salesforce. We could also add whatever other application sets they need. So that's where that whole group and role of understanding, that whole business role of what transactions and what authorizations do they need across the system really makes sense. So now when I'm going through this, I can see I have an audit trail of what happened inside of this workflow. So it was started by the system. Why? Because the system just found an event, because that department changed. But then I came in and I approved it. And then after I approved it, it did all the provisioning. So it removed those roles, added back some things, and now that user is able to access the new authorizations inside of the system. Simple as that. Nice, clean, consistent. Full automation around it and full audit trail. The nice part really boils down to, with the approval, that's a workflow. That's the way this one was designed as an example. You can really set the workflows up to do whatever you want. In this scenario, as I said, I had an approval. When I think about self-service users or onboarding an employee or say a student, for example, you can onboard them completely with the permissions that they need. It would also create what they needed inside of Active Directory. So then when you're talking about that full loop, once you gave them their credentials for Active Directory to authenticate to your network and applications, they can immediately launch into PeopleSoft. They can go in and update their person record. They can update their banking information. They can, they're a new hire. They can go update whatever they need to do because they have all their roles and permissions, and you've implemented with single sign-on. It even integrate with multi-factor at that particular point. So let's go see what happened in the PeopleSoft system. So I'm going to go back to the user profiles here real quick and open that up. And let's go look at the roles. The roles. So we can see now they have a very different role inside of the system. And all of that was done via our Pathlock system and controls. If I were to log into Active Directory, you would see different authorizations there as well. So that's what we're talking about with the whole compliant provisioning and deprovisioning, and why that's important to creating that loop inside of Zero Trust. Because one of the big difficult challenges for many organizations is that provisioning side. So automate the provisioning, make it blend into your entire process flow, and make it very consistent. Now, when you're talking about your security administrators, they can go focus on the 10, 15, 20% that are your super users that have access to very high privileged data and are doing other things inside of your system. So just a little bit of the demo that I wanted to show you. So let's kind of jump back to the PowerPoint here. And, so recommendations on implementing, zero trust security model. One, you have to start with implementing multi-factor authentication, and you need to implement that where the challenge is important and where it's targeted. You cannot just blanket the users with, a multi-factor challenge every time. They'll become very desensitized to it. I've actually seen it. And I can give you an example of it. Back when we actually used to go to conferences in person, I had two people sitting at a table. They had their iPhones were up on the table, and all of a sudden one of them got a push notification from Duo. One of them grabbed the phone and approved it. The problem was it wasn't even that person's phone. It was the other person's phone. And if you've got somebody that just responds to multi-factor authentication like that, obviously you're not doing it in an effective manner. Security is best done when it's least obtrusive and most effective. And you do that by having the users understanding why they're having to go through those process checks. And multi-factor is a big challenge with that. And then control access, least privileged. You need to align the access privileges with the level of risk. Go in and mask data. You need to implement that MFA. You need to protect the data for that employee so they know, hey, my organization respects me and they want to keep my data secure. That's what they're going to get out of it. They're going to see that my organization cares. When you do MFA efficiently and effectively, you're probably going to have the users call you up and say, hey, since you did it this way, can you also protect this data? Can you also protect that over there? Okay, great. Yeah, we can do that. Why? I know that's happened. That's how, when you implement security effectively, that's what the end game can be. And I don't know many organizations that if you raise your hand out there would say, yeah, we had users ask for MFA around certain, transactions. Well, they know they want their data protected. So, if you implement it in a way that they understand, oh, this is why I'm having to go through MFA challenge because I have least privilege. They don't understand least privilege. They're probably not necessarily familiar with that term, but if you're protecting their data and making them go through those steps through least privileged and multi-factor, they layer together very effectively to secure your application, whether they're accessing data, and a lot of people will say, oh, well, I'm on a VPN is just another connection to your system. That's all it really is. Sometimes it makes it even harder to figure out what users are doing or what they're accessing inside of your system. And then, so it's just another connection point for me. It might increase the risk, it might decrease the risk, but it's not necessarily a solution. And kind of the post-COVID world, there was a lot of challenges around VPNs anyway. So we can also streamline the PeopleSoft, access and governance here. So it's one of the things that you saw me go through. So we automated the joiner leave remover process to where you can see how we can do that and integrating that with Active Directory. So now that life cycle becomes fully integrated into your process flow, so you don't have to worry about it. Once that process goes through, those users are going to have access to Active Directory or your identity provider, and they're going to be able to walk through and implement and access all of their controls or authorizations inside of the PeopleSoft system. So that's why you see the two of those tied together so tightly. So one thing that I did want to comment on, if you schedule a demo by 12/31 and you email events@Pathlock, you can receive a Starbucks gift card as well. So with that, I'm going to open it up for any questions. As I said earlier, you can see or submit questions on the GoToWebinar control panel. So I will also bring Stephanie back in as well.
Thank you, Greg. Again, if you have any questions, please add them now into the question box. I'm not seeing any questions right now, but if you have any of those, put those in the chat box. Again, I just wanted to reiterate that I put the link in the chat for the schedule of events today for the rest of the PeopleSoft Innovation Day during the Innovation Series. So if you would like to register for any of the other sessions we have coming up, then we would be happy to see you at those events. I saw a hand go up, but I didn't see a question come in. If you have any questions and we don't see them on here, please reach out to us at info@pathlock.com. And with that, we just wanted to thank you for coming to this webinar, and we hope to see you at future events.